welcome.
Okay, well, thank you for having me here.
I had a very hard time of introducing you because your bio is so impressive. How would you introduce yourself in 3 sentences?
Well, I'm someone who teaches at the Stanford Graduate School of Business, and I'm also someone who teaches at the Stanford D School, Design School, and I also am a writer, producer, director of films, both documentary and narrative features. I should just add that one of the things that's great about being at Stanford is that they encourage people who are out there working on in sort of the outside of academia to also be inside of academia.
Yeah, I think that's a great combination. Actually, at one of your classes, I've heard that the idea of filming came out of Stanford. I've never heard of that before.
Yeah, that's a great story, which I don't know if you want me to tell, but the birth of the entire entertainment industry in some ways, or modern entertainment industry, obviously people have been doing plays, since the Greeks, but the modern entertainment industry came out of a bet between Leland Stanford, who founded this university, and his son. And the bet had to do with when a horse runs, do all 4 feet leave the ground? And he hired an eccentric Scottish photographer named Edward Muybridge, who did a series of experiments not far from where we're sitting. And those are his famous pictures, which you can see with multiple exposures. And in fact, the horse did leave the ground, which wasn't known at the time. And if you put those pictures on what was called a kinescope and spun it around, that became what the first moving motion picture.
Wow, that's an amazing story. So all this started up in Stanford and in Silicon Valley.
Exactly.
And now we see that, like coming back from the Stanford and now to the current Hollywood. A lot of people are speaking or are just mentioning the Hollywood power.
Right.
What is, all is about?
Well,
what is so special about Hollywood?
Well, it's an interesting question. For better or worse, American entertainment, has defined entertainment for a long time. I mean, there are national industries all over the world. I mean, there are powerful industries in China and France and all over. But, this has always been sort of the center. And since the beginning of the entertainment industry, folks from other countries have wanted to come here. I mean, some of the greatest directors are, foreign-born. Billy Wilder, was foreign-born. Charlie Chaplin was foreign-born. Ang Lee is foreign-born. I mean, the list is just endless. So, and the United States runs a surplus balance of trade with virtually every nation in the world in entertainment products. So you may like it, you may hate it, but it's a cultural and business reality that this is where, it's coming from. And now there's this intersection of Hollywood and Silicon Valley, which is, further, enhancing its power.
Yeah, so who are the major players?
In Silicon Valley or in Hollywood? Well, so, Hollywood and Silicon Valley used to have this very uneasy relationship, in some ways still do, that you have this situation where, in Silicon Valley, things are measurable. There's data and things to measure, and there's lots of statistics and backing and precision engineering. In Hollywood, 450 miles to the south of here, literally operates behind facades, and celebrates the Kardashians, and so there is this sense of, sort of wariness on both sides. And it used to be that Hollywood made the content and Silicon Valley made, the devices, like you're sitting here. I mean, they didn't literally make the devices, they kind of designed them. They were largely made in China. But, companies like Apple would make the devices and all of the programming would come out of Hollywood. Well, now you have this shift where you have folks in Silicon Valley, saying, hey, well, we want to make content for this. So you have, the Apples of the world, and you have the Facebooks of the world, and you have Alphabet, which is part of Google, which is making content as well, not to mention the Netflixes and so on. And now a lot of content is, coming out of Silicon Valley companies, which is further, changes the relationship between technology and Hollywood.
Yeah, I really like what you said, that Hollywood and Silicon Valley are marriage of love and suspicious, creating the future of entertainment. Actually, that's the saying. It's kind of a marriage.
It is a marriage, and it has its ups and it has its downs. It's part of what I like to teach my students is that, creating powerful entertainment product in some ways is figuring out what hasn't been done before, where data has to do with what has been done before. So if data defines success, Amazon would have one success after another because they have just about more data than anybody else. I mean, there's other companies with a lot of data too. But I think that they're a little bit suspicious of each other. There's different ways of spending money, and I think that, they're dancing around each other a bit. But the reality is there's a lot of money coming from these tech companies. They're putting more and more content on, and they're going to start defining product. I think if you control the eyeballs, you control, the future of content. And these companies control the eyeballs.
Yeah, actually that's a very interesting trend because what I see, people talk that we have like a marriage of Silicon Valley and Hollywood, but the part of the Hollywood of entertainment industry is already in Silicon Valley.
Right.
We have Pixar, which is like literally, here.
Right.
We have Netflix, which is like literally like headquartered here.
Right, well they're sort of interesting. Those companies have a little bit different profile. Netflix is sort of a technology company, which is basically making entertainment product. And you're absolutely right, they are headquartered here, but the product is coming out of LA. I mean, considered the hottest place in LA is the Netflix lobby. I mean, when you sit in the Netflix lobby, it's like this parade of like showrunners and movie stars, and everyone is coming through because it has heat. Hollywood runs on, heat or perceived heat, that people want to be around you. Netflix has a ton of heat, and they're making a lot of stuff. Netflix is making this year about 82 movies. They're making, I think it's like 700 TV series exclusive to them or made by them. And I think Pixar is sort of a fascinating company in that Pixar, they are making all their things here. And Pixar is sort of a unique company in that they have never had a failure, which part of making an entertainment product is, you have failures. I mean, the biggest directors and the biggest studios, they all have failures. And Pixar, to date, has not had a failure. And it's an incredible record.
Yeah, I think that also the unique thing about Pixar movies or cartoons is that people watch it, notwithstanding the age, and they are not getting actually, like out of date. All of them.
That's a really good point. I used to always go to the Pixar films with my kids. So I always thought, it's a room full of kids. But I knew Steve Jobs a tiny bit, and I brought that up to him, and he said, yeah, but lots of adults go. You just don't go to the screenings where the adults go, and that was accurate. I mean, and if you look at their movies, they appeal to the adults and the children, which is not an easy trick. But I remember seeing films with kids, and I think we were both equally touched, even as my kids get older. Yeah, it's a really remarkable company, and they have a remarkable work ethic where everyone contributes together. And if their building was designed in a large part by Steve Jobs, which had forced interactions. If I just take one a second, it's kind of fascinating. All the animators get their little sort of creative space, and they build these sort of huts where they can create. One looks like a tiki bar, and one looks like a surfing area, and one looks like a haunted house, or whatever it is. They all create their own spaces, so there's a lot of freedom that they give in the service of creating an atmosphere where people can do their best work.
Yeah, so at the end we have these creative cartoons and creative films from them. Actually, I think that all this set out matters. That's kind of the part of the Silicon Valley culture where a lot of the tech companies are investing into, how their offices looks, how people feel inside in order for them to be more creative and efficient. And
yeah, if you think about the traditional workspaces, everyone was divided up into their little silos. When Google was expanding and becoming a big company, they would sometimes move into a big building and they would shut off half the building and they keep it empty just to force everyone together to collaborate with each other, because they truly believed that there was an intersection of everybody being together. There's a famous story at Google where when Eric Schmidt came, who was instrumental in building Google in a major way, an engineer walked by his office and saw, wait a sec, Eric Schmidt, there's no one else in his office, and took his laptop and, put it right next to Eric Schmidt's and basically moved in with Eric Schmidt, and to Eric Schmidt's credit, he's like, okay, that's fine, that's the culture here. And I would say in most other companies, if a lower level employee, plopped their laptop down in the office of the CEO, they would be calling security. And in Google, it was just, something that they did.
Yeah, I think that's a part of the beauty being here and around here. And the same for Stanford.
Right.
If you just walk around, you can meet billionaires. You can meet, Oscar-winning directors walking around teaching. And I've heard a joke at Stanford GSB that Stanford Graduate School of Business is only potentially one graduate business school in the US that has an Oscar-winning director teaching
that's
at
nice
the
to
school.
say.
Yeah, just coming back to the traditional Hollywood.
Yes.
It's not so about art now.
Right.
It's more about business. And
Right.
who are the major players now? What we see, whether the scene changed a lot for the last 20 years.
Yeah, the scene has changed, quite a bit over the last 20 years. I mean, first of all, the international market drives movies. I mean, if we're talking about traditional movies for quite a while now, it's been over 70% of a film's box office is coming internationally. So therefore, if you're trying to come up with a movie that wants to be successful, it has to play as well in San Francisco as it does in, Tokyo or Moscow or Kiev or, London, wherever. It has to play all over the world. It has to appeal to, diverse, audiences, which in some ways, I think, hurts the quality of the movies. Because, they always said that Arnold Schwarzenegger, I don't know, said less than 100 words in his first Terminator, which is, I've said more than 100 words in the last 3 sentences. But it's this idea that you have to appeal in a really big way. Going back to your statement on Pixar, that's one of the reasons the Pixar films do well, because they're easily dubbed into other languages and they are intended to play internationally. So you have movies which have to play internationally. Streaming has become an enormous source of income. Physical product is fading away, like DVDs and Blu-rays. It's just every year gets smaller and smaller. But there's still a lot more money, almost doubled at the box office in home entertainment, which includes, video on demand and streaming and so on. So I think audiences have demonstrated that they're interested in quality product, regardless of who makes it or where it comes from. And folks will sometimes want to see an IMAX movie and, grand size screen, or they'll want to see it on their iPhone. So we're in a very bifurcated world at this point.
I think that the role of the international market is increasing from year to year. But is US and Canada are still major revenue makers? Yeah,
what they call I'm sorry, just 1 second. What they call the North American market is still the world leader, the US and Canada. But within a couple of years, China will surpass it. What's different about it is China's market is almost all internal. Mm-hmm. Most Chinese films do not travel well, whereas the U.S. films are intended to travel well. So that is, a bit of a difference. But, as I mentioned before, you have, rich film industries in a country like Korea, which is, a fairly small country, but makes a lot of product, and that product plays, in China and sometimes in the U.S. and so on. So I think that that the U.S. still leads. But just by numbers, China will surpass it within a couple of years.
Because of the audience.
Yeah, China's got a lot of people there, and the thing to remember is that, entertainment product is being disseminated via a lot of it's on mobile, and it's a very wired country and will continue to be. And also the thing to remember about China too is, there's still a chunk of the Chinese population that's quite poor, and as they become wealthier, they will be consuming a lot more product.
What about theaters and home entertainment? What is the ratio?
Most money on a film is not made in the theatrical release. The theatrical release is what drives things. So if you if you make a movie in this country, the theatrical release is where you get your actress to go on the talk shows. You try to get her on the cover of a magazine and so on. So that drives everything. But it's usually, I think, about 20% of a film's final gross is U.S. theatrical release. The rest of it's coming from international, it's coming from video on demand. And if you think about a successful film, not just, from the U.S., I mean, take any successful film, but in the U.S. you make a film here and it has all these various windows that it can play in video on demand and free TV and on iTunes and so on, boom, 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 boom. And I think that's true for many countries too. So if you're making a film, that's has some box office potential, it goes to France and it plays theatrically, and then it goes. All those windows are open to that film. And that's always kept in mind, especially the major markets, which, the major markets are very, very significant to Hollywood. And some of the major markets are pretty obvious. It's England and Spain and Germany and Italy and China and Korea and so on. I mean, these are big markets and important markets.
Yeah, I have this phrase from Barry Diller of Fox and USA Broadcasting. He said that the movie business is no longer the hit movie business. It's now a horrible thing called a tentpole business. The business formation is now huge blockbuster movies that have to do was 500 million to break even. Do you believe in that?
Yeah,
and what are the tentpoles?
Well, a tentpole is just a star-driven, large film, that's intended to make an enormous amount of money and usually has very high budgets. So you're spending a lot in marketing, and you're hoping to reap the returns on it. So these are a lot of the Marvel movies are this way. What he's talking about, why it's a horrible thing, is that it flattens out this kind of quality. That if you think about movies that have been, good movies to you, most, in my opinion, most really good movies are a little bit subversive, and when you're trying to appeal to everybody, it quashes that a little bit. It has to appeal all over for it to make money. So when you have, all this money at stake, you spend a couple $100 million on a budget, or 100, 150, and you spent, vast sums marketing it, you have to make that kind of money back. And so it tends to, to reduce creativity. I mean, they always say that, in the early days of Hollywood, the people who ran it, they weren't that sophisticated in terms of their background. A lot of them, had come out of, a lot of them were immigrants, and they'd come out of, different businesses that weren't Hollywood. They changed their names, but they were creating this new industry. And one of the things they realized in creating the new industry is they had to take chances. And so in some ways, the old crowd was more willing to take chances than the newer crowd is.
Yeah. So that's an interesting trend.
Yeah, and it's also, I think it's worth noting that the big entertainment companies have been around for a long time. I mean, these companies go way back. I mean, you think about Disney or Fox or Warner Brothers. These are all companies that are very old companies. They're legacy companies that, really stood the test of time. Yeah.
What about TV series? It's actually the kind of, are they making comeback, or what do we see now with TV series?
I think it's certainly true. I mean, you have close to 500 TV series now, and a lot of folks think that, TV is doing much better product. I mean, this is, this kind of stuff that you're seeing now, drawing enormous audiences. It's a bigger canvas for the director and everyone else involved to paint on. And I think many folks feel, including me, that the best work out there is being done on TV series. And and also they're playing internationally. This is always part of a desire to make shows that play. And I think that we as a country are now increasingly watching foreign content that comes in from the U.S., international content. I myself watch a show called, Spiral, which is a French procedural, and it's gotten a lot of good notice. I watched a Danish series called Borgen, which is doing quite well. I mean, it's interesting if you think about, a lot of, it's good programming coming out of Scandinavia. Scandinavia is quite small population, but they do quite high quality product. And I think the idea is you come up with a product that people will find an audience for.
Yeah, a lot of TV series are now, we have, like among the cast, like top stars, top film and movie stars. Especially with HBO or some other productions. And look at the Game of Thrones from HBO. It's like viral now.
Yeah, I mean, Game of Thrones is complete juggernaut. I mean, it's a worldwide phenomena that people have responded to. And look, it's very hard to create something like this. HBO has been trying to create another one. It's challenging to do, but they've been extremely successful. And and I think they've done it in a way by not compromising. The shows have their own look to them, and they're often very violent, but they've done it without compromise. I think that's led to its success.
Yes, I think that what we see now with the Game of Thrones, I think that now we have this a very, like high level for all other series to reach.
Well, it's a really good question. Game of Thrones is all about spectacle, but I think nothing replaces a good story well told, and there are small movies that are, extremely good stories. I mean, one of the top films last year was Roma, and Roma was, a film, filmed in Spanish and native Mexican language, and it was, kind of a small film. I mean, it was a very powerful film about, family and the women working for the family. So I think that, again, it's a little bit of a bifurcated thing. You can have enormous spectacle, but at the end of the day, you really have to care about the characters. I mean, that's, look, all drama, sort of goes back to this. I think that, I tell my students, there's this expression that goes back to Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, and lots of others have taken credit for it, but there's only two stories out there. And the story is a stranger comes to town or a man goes on a journey. And so, these are like old concepts, but if you care about the characters, you can make it work. And there's, absolutely fine work that's being done and, really small stories. So I think you are seeing this willingness of audiences to embrace the Game of Thrones, but they're also embracing smaller shows as well.
What about documentaries? You are as a documentary, film director. Well, what do you see? What are the trends now?
Well, I think now the trends, there's more places than ever to show documentaries. This is a kind of interesting year. This year had a number of documentaries gross over $10 million, which doesn't happen that often, like Will You Be My Neighbor and RBG and Free Solo and so on. So this is unusual. But what's happening, because there's so many places to show films, people are hungry for content. Netflix is hungry for content. Amazon is hungry for content. Hulu is hungry. I mean, so all these places are buying the product. And going back to something we talked about before is that if you think about audiences, audiences used to get their entertainment product from very traditional places. But now audiences just want good product. You think about it, not that long ago, Amazon was a online marketplace for physical goods. AMC was like a network that no one ever heard of, and Netflix was sending discs through the mail. And so now, AMC does Breaking Bad, other shows is extremely popular, as are the others, and I think audiences have demonstrated that they will go where the content is. And because, documentaries typically don't have a big theatrical release, there's this hunger for them on television, and it really is a resurgence and renaissance.
Yes, and now, what about foreign films on US market? You mentioned a couple of series before, TV series before. Do you predict that there will be more of that content in US using this, untraditional kind of channels?
I think that if you're talking about theatrical, it's tough. I mean, the U.S., I think this is a weakness of the U.S. Like, as a country, we don't really seem to like subtitles. And then this doesn't seem to be true elsewhere. Certainly, you go to films in Europe, there are subtitles. China, every film has a subtitle on it because it has to do with different dialects and similar written language. But as the U.S., we don't seem to like it that much on the subtitles. And I think that is not good, and I think that it hurts a bit. And traditionally, it's been difficult for foreign films to make a big impact at the U.S. box office. However, on TV, it's another story, and that people are really embracing it. So if you're looking, again, look at Netflix, which is unquestionably a leader in this now. Netflix is making shows in Spanish. Netflix is doing films, for the Indian market. They're doing Indian originals. I mean, there are, films being made in multiple languages for it, but I think it also appeals to, audiences will watch films in other languages, on TV with I think a greater willingness than they will in theaters. And I think that this is definitely a trend for the future.
One more question related to the trends on the market is that keeping attention. Our attention span was 12 seconds in 2000, and now it's 8 seconds. It's even less than the attention of a goldfish. Do you think that it will influence the market and the products on the market?
Yeah, I think unquestionably shorter attention span, has an influence on folks. That you can look at this, if you just look at a movie from, 20 years ago or 40 years ago or longer, you can see the actual cuts are longer, So I think there's this desire to keep folks engaged. So it increases the pace of the films. But I think the head of Microsoft said, in the future, the true competition will be for human attention. So we have to compete, for attention. So I think absolutely, it's going to impact the way films are made and other entertainment product is. And I don't know it's necessarily, it's necessarily a good thing. I mean, we're also a multi-screen culture. A lot of people watch a movie with another, or TV series, not a movie. A lot of people watch TV series on another screen that's open. So I think you are competing for people's attention. And look, this is where, but it's also like, a big tent. If you have a hit show, like, a Hamilton show, you're going to be sitting in the theater for, several hours and just be enthralled with what's there, and you don't have another screen going on. So I think part of it is it increases, the desire for filmmakers to make something that, really engages an audience in a powerful way. But again, if you look at, if you read the books of like, Dickens or Tolstoy or whatever, they were writing in an era where there wasn't any competition, but they still had you, reading and wanting to know what happens and pushing you through the narrative. And especially, a lot of those books over in the 19th century were serialized in magazines, and they take you right up to the point, and then they'd drop the curtain, and you want to know what happened. I mean, essentially, we're still doing the same thing. If you're watching in TV, it typically Game of Thrones, same thing. They take you right up to the point and they drop the curtain, and you want to find out what's going to happen the next week.
Ukrainian government recently started providing financing to Ukrainian filming industry and entertainment industry. You were filming in a number of countries, including Australia and in Europe. What do you think about the state support of filming industry? That's not the thing that you have in US because you don't need it.
No, it's a really, really good question. And and I think it's a little bit of a complicated question actually, because there's a sense out there that by encouraging a film industry, it ties in with culture and advancing stories, and it's a good thing to do. So a lot of countries do it. As I mentioned, Australia does it. France is probably the leading example that they do. When you go and buy a ticket, a box office, go to the theatrical box office at France, some of that money is supporting French films. And France has a very robust film industry, in part because all these rules and laws that encourage you to support it. So in general, I think it's a really good thing. I think you should support it for cultural reasons, for business reasons, and reasons that you want to keep your film industry alive and healthy, and you can export your stories, and that has a kind of soft power to it. But the flip side of it is that, how does a country spend its money? I mean, I have a friend who's a prominent Mexican filmmaker, and he's against it. I mean, his view is, Mexico's a poor country, we should be using our money building hospitals, not funding movies. So that's the other side of the argument. But, my personal view is that this is, probably the most powerful art form ever invented. And and you should put money into it. I mean, no one asks my opinion when they decide whether or not they're going to build a new aircraft carrier. You know, that's considered a national priority in this country. You know, funding the arts is considered less of a national priority. And if you look, especially at Europe, I think Europe is way, way, way ahead of the U.S. in terms of supporting the arts, including, you know, entertainment and cinema. And I think it's a wise investment for a country.
For Ukraine, it's also a matter of national security because we are fighting a lot with Russian propaganda,
right,
including in entertainment. A lot
right,
of like Russian-generated content, which is funded somehow by the state. It's, you know, like anti-Ukrainian or had this like Russian imperial ambitions. So I believe that for Ukraine to have its own content, entertainment content, appealing to young people, appealing to kids, telling more like stories that are true about Ukrainian history, not the Soviet Union history, like should be there.
Yeah, I could not agree with you more because, you know, one of the sad realities is people will watch something and they'll think it's real because they've, you know, seen it on TV or they've seen it in a theater. So in a situation where you have this enormously powerful neighbor that's cranking out unfavorable things, I think you're sort of obliged, you know, to tell the truth of the story and to tell your own stories. I mean, it's, you know, it's sort of a little bit of a unique situation. I mean, I think France is making its moves because they're trying to preserve their industry and the culture. But in this case, you know, I think that it's really important to get the word out. I just think it's also important to make films that people want to see. You know, there's a whole thing where, you know, no one wants to be forced to eat their spinach. You know, you want to cook the spinach in a way that's delicious. So if you're making, you know, powerful, emotional stories that are tied to, you know, Ukrainian history, and, you know, in the past or current term, then people want to see it. I think you sometimes get into trouble, not you as Ukraine, but other countries have done this, is they make films that, you know, are not particularly good or not particularly appealing, but have the right politics. I think that you can jam in a lot of, you know, social messages into something, but you also have to make a good movie.
Yeah, actually we have a good example of a Ukrainian TV series or TV show broadcasted on Netflix that was directed by our president-elect entertainment company and starring our president-elect Volodymyr Zelensky. The show is called like Servant of the People.
Right.
It's broadcasted on Netflix. I think that it's rather popular now.
Yeah, well, I think folks are just looking for good content. I mean, like the show I mentioned before, I watched the show Borgen, which had 3 seasons on it, and here's the plot of Borgen. It doesn't sound very sexy. It's a centrist Danish prime minister trying to put together a coalition, you know? I mean, it doesn't sound sexy, but it's brilliantly done. And this is the power of entertainment, that it pulls you into the story, and suddenly folks who don't have any particular interest in Danish politics, it sort of pulls you in. And I truly believe, whether it's a story from the Ukraine or any country, if it pulls you in via the characters and the challenges, then you will be sucked into the story. Look, storytelling is also about intention and obstacle. You have an intention to do something and there's an obstacle stopping you. And if you're cheering for that person, you know, to overcome, you know, her or his obstacle, then you have an audience, and that, you know, story can take place, you know, in Kiev, you know, or it can take place in Kentucky, but you're caring about human beings.
If you are to write or direct a movie about Ukraine, what this movie would be about?
You know, I'm a big fan of the stories of Isaac Babel, so I would go to Isaac Babel first.
That's actually a good answer. Just coming back to your, you know, like life path is that you were a fellow at Stanford, at Night Fellow program, and what are the major reasons for you? You know, like to come to Stanford to do this fellowship?
You know, it's a really good question. I think that, you know, just for me on a personal level, I just wanted to be around, you know, the great minds of Stanford, and you meet people from all over the world like yourself who come and they all have something to contribute. And that was enormously rewarding to me. I mean, it's truly an international community where I teach. The students are over 40% international. You know, California itself is what's called a majority state, that there are more minorities here and majorities. But here in Silicon Valley, people are coming from all over the world. Like in my children's middle school ceremony, people said, at the graduation, hello, whatever language they spoke at home. And for my sons, people came in, they said hello in like 27 languages. So I think that, that people are coming all over the world to be here. And I think you have times in history where cities become the city where people want to go to. I mean, London had its time of this, and Paris had its time for this, and New York had its time for this. And I think now Silicon Valley is becoming that place that people want to come here, they want to create something. And that sense of, the international appeal of it, and creating, the future too. If you think about it, where we're sitting right now is certainly not the political capital of America. It's certainly, not the cultural capital, but, it is a tech capital. And tech is driving everything else. So because we're in the tech capital and more people are coming in every day, and it will continue to be the tech capital. In some ways, this is really the cutting edge of America for sure, and in many ways, cutting edge of, a major center for the rest of the world.
Yeah, that's maybe the reason that you teach entertainment industry class at Graduate School of Business now.
Yeah, I mean, look, technology is, directly intertwined with the future of entertainment and will continue to be such. So you have to have a situation where the entertainment is there, it's being pushed further and further every day, but at the end of the day, you also have to tell good stories.
Actually, your class is oversubscribed at Graduate School of Business. What is the reason for that?
I think there's a hunger to learn about entertainment and where it's going in the future. Look, there's an amazing amount of great stuff that happens at Stanford. But if you're, studying Greek mythology, it probably doesn't change that much from year to year. But if you're in a field like, you're in, it's changing a lot. And if you're a field that I'm in, it's changing a lot. I mean, a person who was head of a TV network said something interesting to me. He stood in front of my class and said, I came here last year, and when Bill asked me to come back this year, I thought I would dust off my PowerPoint, make a few changes, and show you mostly the same thing. I looked at it, everything changed in a year. So I think the idea is this is an industry that's dynamic, it's shifting, it's changing, and that one thing you can say for a lot of the crowd that's at Stanford is they're embracing that. They want to be part of the future. And it's so I think in some ways the entertainment industry is changing. It's keeps redefining what the future is, and my students also are here looking to try to figure out what the future is as well.
Major part of your class are guest speakers that are coming from Hollywood. Like at last class, we had Nina Jacobson, producer of Crazy Rich Asians and former president of Walt Disney Company. And we had Ron Meyer, president and chief executive of Universal Studios. Like, what are the reasons for those people to come over here and to teach? In addition to making a favor to their friend.
Well, I think that I think it's a rewarding experience, to teach. I think that it's a way of giving back. And look, quite candidly, they're really good students, and they ask really good questions. And sometimes, I hear a question being formed, and I'm thinking to myself, that's a really good question. Then I notice, the speaker's eyes get a little bigger. I say, yeah, that's a really good question. And I think that one of the joys of teaching is that students push you and they make you consider things that you may not have thought about before, and I think that's what the speakers respond to. They want to be pushed in these directions, and I love it in the classroom when people are pushing you in novel and new directions, and I think that's what the speakers respond to. They respond to the intelligence and the creativity, and the energy of the room, and they like being in that room where they're being, challenged in a good way, and so that's why I think they like it, and also just appeals to the, there's a lot of people teaching at Stanford who, have plenty of money. They don't do it for the money. They do it because, they like being part of the process and they like teaching.
You teach this class for quite some time.
Yeah.
Do you have a lot of students that actually join the entertainment industry? Are there any successes?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's people, it's not like movie star kind of successes, but there are people doing extremely well. They're high executives in higher companies. I mean, I have a former TA of mine who's coming back to the next class, who's head of Pocket Gems, which is a company that's been downloaded 450 million times. you know, and just, you know, it's a gaming company. So I have folks all over. Yeah, I mean, so they come back. I mean, when you're a teacher, you stay in touch with, you don't stay in touch with all your students, but you do stay in touch with a bunch of them, and I do hear from them. I have another one, student out of the GSB is a company called Masterclass, which is, teaching, all sorts of classes online. I have folks at Netflix and all sorts of companies. Yeah, so I think that there's a group of students that love the entertainment business and they go into it.
So that's the most rewarding for you?
Yeah, it's very rewarding because, folks tell you that, the class had some influence on their lives, and you hope it's a good influence in their lives. I mean, sometimes, I think sometimes, folks, even who get to the business school and they've often achieved quite a lot, they're also asking themselves kind of, who are they? Who do they want to be? It's a time of your life when you're asking these questions, and what do you want to contribute? And I think, the entertainment industry, often contributes a lot of really good things.
Yeah. Entertainment industry's intersection of art and business. What are the ratio in this intersection? Well, what is the ratio that you would like to see?
Well, I think, look, it's called show business. It's not called show, and it's not called business. The reason it's called show business, you don't stay in business very long, unless you, create product that, people want to see. So I think that it's a big tent, and as part of that tent, you can have very arty films. Are not expected to make that much money, but you can also make films that, are, just, it's all business. But even in the films that are all business, it's still an art. I mean, if you look at Game of Thrones, which is a staggeringly successful product for HBO, there is an awful lot of art in there. I mean, it's art with everything that you do in a film. Where do you place the camera? How do the actors say something? What's the writing? I mean, there's art, in every minute of film. Sometimes it's not very good, and sometimes it's staggeringly good and blows you away, and you're just in awe of the talent of the people making it. But there is this mix to it, and I find that enormously, I'm happy just to be part of it.
What is the project that you are currently working on?
Well, actually, I'm working with a former student of mine on a project where she was sexually abused as a teenager, and now 20 years later, she's going back after the guy who did it. And that's she's a Dutch student, so a lot of it takes place in Holland. So I'm working on that project at the moment.
So it's a documentary?
It's a documentary, and then I'm also working on a number of other projects. I have a film that premiered at the Tribeca Film Festival about a iconic group from the 1990s called Sublime, and and I have a number of other projects I'm working on at the same time as well.
Yeah, I think that like you are the person that was shooting and directing a lot of documentary movies. I think it's very hard in terms of like your personal feelings to shoot movies or films about the things, like the bad things that happen all over the world. Like how you overcome all this? Well, sometimes you just feel really privileged to tell people stories. Like a film that I feel good about having made, even though it's a very dark subject, I made a film on Nanking, which was the rape of Nanking. And while we're making the film, I had a Chinese associate producer, and she would call me up every night and say she was just crying because the stories were so hard. And then you get pulled into the emotion of this, when you go there and you hear all these, stories. And for those who don't know the story, in 1937, the invading Japanese army went into Nanking, China, which was China's capital, and in 6 weeks, raped tens of thousands of women, murdered hundreds of thousands of people. And it's very dark, but I think you also feel like you can bring this story to folks, and I think that's very, valuable and important. I played with that film literally all over the world, and in Asia, people know the story, but a lot of places people have never heard of it. So you feel like, it's sort of a blessing and an honor, to have the opportunity to tell the story. Now we're coming back to this or that short answer questions.
Yeah. Okay.
What is Ukraine in one sentence for you? I
think of Ukraine as sort of, a small, wait, let me say it again.
Yeah.
I think about Ukraine as a medium size and, country with a rich history that's being challenged by an enormously powerful opponent.
Your top 3 films of all the times.
Well, the top 3 films, how about this? I'll give you the top, 2 films and my top film last year. So my all-time favorite film is Casablanca. I also thought The Godfather is one of my favorite films. And the best film I saw last year was a Polish film called Cold War.
A movie or TV series you watched last night?
I watched Game of Thrones last night, and what's interesting about that is that I'm not that kind of person that watches fantasy and dragon things, but I watched it and I thought it was truly amazing.
What are you reading right now?
The last book I just finished is called Pachenko, which is a sweeping book about 4 generations of folks of Korean descent living in Japan.
Best piece of advice you've ever been given?
Well, the best piece of advice I was given in film was the head of my film school. There was an Italian person named Antonio Villani, and he said, when you make a movie, people give you 2 hours of their lives, which they're never going to see again. Make sure you give them something for those 2 hours.
That's a great advice. And the last question is, you need to choose Game of Thrones, Big Little Lies, or House of Cards.
Well, I watch all 3 of them, but I've been swept into the Game of Thrones world.
Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much.